Casa Feliz, our mission is threefold. We take care of this house. We keep the legacy of the architect of the house, James Gamble Rogers II, alive. And if you haven't been to our studio over there, make sure you see it before you leave. And we advocate for historic preservation in Winter Park. Yay! Yay! Thank you for being here. So this series has built, I guess, because this is our best crowd we've had yet. So either that or Stephen Pategas has a big fan club. So we talked about Hibbert Castleberry, who was a developer. We talked about Carl Dan, who worked with Sam Stoltz, who was a developer. So the third one is going to be Walter Rose, and they all kind of fit together nicely as developing in that James Gamble Rogers era. So we should have great context for better understanding this house. So Stephen is an award-winning landscape architect and co-owner with his wife Kristen of Hortus Oasis in Winter Park. They provide services in residential, commercial, and specialty garden design and consultation. Following the big move, they designed the gardens right here at Casa Feliz. He is a past board member of the Friends of Casa Feliz and served on the Orwin Manor Westminster Association Board since 1987. Due to his love of history, historic structures, and this Parlor Talk series, he agreed to do tonight's presentation. Thank you, Stephen. It's all yours.
Thank you, Rick. Let's see, I see lots of friendly faces, lots of smiles, lots of Orwin Manorites, which means they're neighbors of mine and Kristen's. And if I don't know you, I hope I get to know you. So, this has been an interesting journey doing this since Rick first asked me about doing a talk. And I'm going to start my timer here so I have an idea where I am. Okay. And so he said, would you like to do something on a talk on the history of Orwin Manor? And previously, having lived in Orwin Manor since 1985 and being involved with helping to write the history of Orwin Manor back with Sally Moon, who was a former resident, I said, okay, yeah, I'll agree to do that. And I attended a lot of Parlor talks, and it's a lot of fun. So tonight, we're going to do something special, okay? I think many of you might have one of these objects on you. Okay, so to make sure you take it out and turn it on, okay? As opposed to turning it off. Yeah, everybody's usually polite here and you never hear any of these go off. So turn it on, because if it goes off during the talk, you donate $25 to Casa Feliz. Okay? Okay, and now that $25 is for a text. If it rings, it's $50. And if it's one of those really obnoxious rings, it's $100, okay? And we'll determine whether it's an obnoxious ring by a raise of hands, okay? So make sure you turn them on, okay?
You already got somebody that.
Yeah, well, that was before I made the thing, so. Okay, so you're forewarned. Okay, so some acknowledgments. My wife, Kristen, of course, she was pouring wine this evening, helping out. Sally Moon, who I mentioned, former Orwin Manorite. Joy Dickinson, a freelance journalist, and had authored zillions of Florida flashbacks in the Orlando Sentinel until recently she retired. Rachel Simmons with the Winter Park Library, who's actually right here in the front. Orange County Regional History Center, and I have to say also Bubble in the Sun, the book by Christopher Knowlton, which you see right there on the screen. And that's what really got me going, because I read that book and I said, wow, the 20s and the land boom in Florida were unbelievable. And so that really got me going and thinking about the connections to Orwin Manor and Central Florida. A lot of that takes place in South Florida, but the impact here was huge as well. And of course, Wikipedia, and then of course, those who saved and continue to treasure Casa Feliz. And thank you for coming here tonight and supporting all of the efforts here. So Florida has attracted people for many years. And I'd say it's best evidenced by a lot of the art that was done here in Florida. When Florida was first explored and people started to come here, it was really tortuous to get here. But over time, it got a lot easier with the railroads and with the roadways that started to come on. Of course, it was all by ship originally. So if you go to the C.C. and Hyatt Brown Museum in Daytona Beach. Has anybody had the good fortune to go there? It's not a short, it's a short drive, and it is an incredible museum. It's beautiful, and the whole structure contains art. It was all done in Florida. And there's world-renowned artists in there. Huge paintings, small paintings. It's really fabulous. In fact, there's one room, and I don't know if they still have that room set up as that way. It's called the weather room. And all the paintings reflect the weather in Florida. And so you can kind of stroll through there and look at those paintings and go, I've been there. I've had that happen to me. Thank God that tornado never hit me. You know, so on and so forth. And then they have good descriptions on the paintings too. So you can go through and you can be looking at these paintings, and it'll tell you where a lot of them were painted. But if you don't look at that, you look at the art first. And if you lived in Florida for a while and you've traveled around, you will start to see that you recognize these places before you even look at the descriptions. And it's really cool. And you really start to, you start to feel that you really do belong here. I'm not a native, moved here in 1985, 82 actually, 85 into Orwin Manor. So I highly recommend going there to get a little feeling for all the scenery in Florida. In fact, this piece of art right here, it was done by Louis Comfort Tiffany. So you've probably all heard about Henry Flagler and his railroad down to the Keys, and you've probably been to some of the hotels that he built originally. So he was kind of dealing with the East Coast, whereas we also had Henry Plant, which is lesser known, but just as powerful in the state of Florida, and they were friendly rivals. And he brought the railroad actually through Winter Park and to the West Coast. So Tampa was really where he did most of his developing. However, it was Henry Flagler who really started it. And he built the hotels in St. Augustine, and he also built hotels in Palm Beach, the Breakers, and had the railroad all the way down to Key West until the hurricane took that out. And that was one of the greatest engineering feats in the world at that time. But Henry Plant built or bought 8 luxury hotels along his railway lines. And he also had steamships as part of his plant system, is what he called it. And you'll notice the dots on the map. Number 5 is actually Winter Park. So the railway came through and he had a hotel there. But in 1891, he opened the Tampa Bay Hotel. So it covered 6 acres. So we're not talking about the grounds, we're talking about the footprint of the hotel, 6 acres, on 150 acres of amenities. And so he had golf courses, and they didn't have pickleball, because pickleball wasn't around at the time, but they had lots of other sports that attracted people there. And of course the architecture, if you haven't been there, is incredible. And if you're driving anywhere near Tampa and through Tampa on the interstates, you're going to see those little onion domes up there. And you're going to go, what the heck is that? Well, stop sometime. It's owned by the University of Tampa now, and within that building that you're seeing there is the Henry Plant Museum. And so Chris and I went there recently, and I was a little disappointed because it didn't have as much history as I thought, but it was jam-packed full of all these furnishings and everything from the rooms, and it was pretty luxurious. So it was definitely worth a trip. So the Seminole Hotel in Winter Park, opened in 1886, destroyed by fire in 1902, so that's 4, 5, 6 years only. Of course, it was rebuilt farther to the north, but he purchased that in 1891, the same year that the Tampa Bay Hotel opened, and the New York Times said it was the best winter hotel between St. Augustine and Tampa. So maybe they were starting to put Winter Park on the map, I would say, all the way back in 1892. So as we're moving on a little closer to our generations and to Walter Rose, our next generation of icons were Addison Meisner, and he was operating in Palm Beach and Boca Raton, Carl Fisher in Miami, D.P. Davis in Tampa, George Merrick in Coral Gables, and Walter W. Rose in Orlando. And you can see the years that they were born, the years they died, and I'm going to touch a little bit on the first 4 and then in more depth on Walter Rose and what he did. Addison Meisner, he designed a lot of houses, a lot of famous houses, many of them destroyed. unfortunately, over time, he was really good at bringing together all different architectural styles. So here he is with his, he was into animals. So he has a parrot on his arm, and he has his monkey, Johnny Brown, on his shoulder. So he's operating in Palm Beach and Boca Raton, and you can see just a few of his structures there. So this is all setting the scene for what's going to take place in Central Florida. Carl Fisher, really interesting, Carl Fisher. He loved automobiles and racing. In fact, he was one of the founders of the Indianapolis Speedway. And it was called the Brickyard, you might have heard that, because it was originally paved in brick. That was a lot of brick. I have no idea where that brick went to when they finally changed the surface, but it was actually a pretty dangerous speedway. But more importantly, he helped develop the Lincoln Highway, which starting in 1912. And by 1915, it was finally completed. And you'll see here how it went coast to coast from New York to San Francisco, the first transcontinental highway in the United States. And it changes route numbers along the way. So a good portion of it is Highway 30. And we had a chance when we were traveling through Iowa and parts of Illinois to travel parts of it. And in fact, a number of years ago, my sister and her husband drove the whole highway from one end to the other. And they said it took a while. And sometimes it wasn't even paved for some of the stretches because new roadways had taken over parts of it. And so the old portions were kind of gravel roads and dirt roads, but they made it. So Carl Fisher, understood that he was picking up where the railroads left off with roadways. But Florida and the legislature were really smart early on because there were very few railroads initially. And the legislature actually passed laws that made it a very sweet deal for people to build railroads. They were given thousands of acres based on how many miles of railroad they put in. So, sweet deal. You put in a few miles of railroad, you get so many thousands of acres. And I think it was like 25 cents an acre, perhaps, something like that. And so it really started to bring the developers in, building railroads, which then started to bring all the people in, because the roads were pretty pathetic at the time. So that was key. So Carl Fisher's next move was really, really important. So 1914 saw the start of the Dixie Highway from Michigan to Florida. So if you're up north, where do you want to go in the wintertime?
Anywhere but up north.
So same old story that we hear today, right, which brings a lot of people here. So if you're starting all the way up here in Michigan, how do you get to all the way down to Florida, and particularly to Miami area? Okay, so you'll notice that it wasn't just one Dixie Highway. There were a number of highways. There were two main north-south routes and lots of transverse routes back and forth, which connected a lot of the roads that way. So then over on the west coast, we have D.P. Davis. You can see his house that he built in Tampa, rather nice house. Obviously, it was after he'd done some of his developing. So he found these two islands out in Tampa Bay that nobody really wanted. And you can see what they looked like in the upper right-hand corner. And really just marshland, although it would have been a great bird sanctuary today if we still had it. And you look what that does for tourism in Florida, in fact. If anybody's been out to the Orlando wetlands, or they've been to a Apopka wetland, wildlife drive. Lots of tourists coming in because of that. So lower right, you'll see Davis Islands as he's developing it, and the islands were actually right here and right here, and that's what they look like developed today. George Merrick. So George Merrick is Coral Gables, and Coral Gables was George Merrick. He made Coral Gables. It didn't exist. And you can see some of the houses he built. You can see the house that he built in with an historic marker. And you can see the Biltmore Hotel that he, with a partner, he built in 1925. So what was Orlando like before the land boom? So Joy Dickinson has a great book. And I found some of these images in her book, which she had gotten from the Florida Archives. And I said, oh, Joy, I scanned those out of your book. And she said, that was really smart, because she said, because I had to pay for them to get them off the archive. Don't you think they look pretty good? So the scanning works pretty well. So alligator wrestling in downtown Orlando. And then 1915, there was a subdivision called Bellevue Heights. And so I was fascinated by that because subdivisions got a lot sexier than this after 1915. But in 1915, this is probably a big deal in Orlando. So I was curious where this was. So I started to search the property record site. So I was looking around. You can put in the subdivision named Bellevue Heights, and some properties will pop up. And so I was looking and looking. It was taking me all different places. It was taking me like all over Orlando. And finally, I struck gold, and I found it. And so as you'll see written there, it's actually just south of the Orlando Regional Medical Center is where this little subdivision was located. So if you've ever been to the Supervisor of Elections office on Cayley, I think maybe that was even part of it. It was just north of there as well. But I guarantee you that those gateway signs got a lot better than that. And of course, this whole subdivision disappeared. I'm sure there were houses built there, but then, it got all rezoned for commercial over time. So the Florida Department of Transportation is doing a little road diet through Orwin Manor on Orange Avenue because we have such a huge speeding problem there, and it narrows down to one lane anyway. So when I met with them on site, we were walking the street, he mentioned something about the 20s. I told him what I was doing, and he said, there's a Sears and Roebuck catalog from the 20s that you might find fascinating. So Googled it up, found a free version online, my favorite, right? And got some pictures and turned them into JPEGs, and here they are. So what was it like in the 20s? So you're looking at lots of interesting things that you might have seen in your grandparents' or great-grandparents' houses, perhaps, or maybe in museums. So you're looking at, quote, the modern bathrooms. You're seeing at the walnut furniture, really interesting lamps, stoves. And of course, I love the appliance store. There must be about 35 different waffles in there, waffle irons and toasters. And that's not all. You also had teddy bears and dolls and Dapper Dans off there to the right. And of course, something that looks really reminiscent of Flappers because this was the era of the Flappers. So Sears and Roebuck, you could get everything, apparently. So you could get cameras, you could get plant material, ornamental shrubs. Although I looked at this really carefully, and none of these will grow in Florida, so it was not a catalog for Florida. You could get outdoor swings, that would have worked. You would have needed it here because of the sun and the rain, that would have been great. But I was really nervous about seeing what was over to the right, because I'm seeing asbestos and I'm seeing creosote, which are two things that are totally banned, probably like a couple of decades ago. But I think my favorite was the Elgin motorbike. And I don't know if you can see it well enough there, but there is not a motor on there. You are the motor. But it was clever marketing. And so marketing was really the key to what really helped make all of this land boom stuff happen, because marketing was it. And I think the marketers might have made more money than the land developers, actually. So the next slide is a little bit of a throwback slide. It's really curious because this next slide I came across, and it sat in my computer for probably about 10 years, and then when this talk came around, I thought, what is the story on this slide, on this image? So I had no clue where it came from, and I asked around and no one knew. So some research and maybe a magnifying glass at the time turned up some clues. So first of all, right here, a curb sign says Orange Avenue. So all of a sudden I knew what road it was. Now I kind of thought it was Orange Avenue because it was bricked and it was 2 lanes, and that was typical from that era. Okay, a little more exploration. Either these were really funky driveways or they were crossing streets. So there's one crossing here, one crossing here. So how many intersections on Orange Avenue can you think of that are crossing like that? So there's 2 that I could think of. You might think of another one. So to bring it closer to home though, right here, okay, this sign right here says Orwin Manor Service Station Auto Repairing. Well, that had to be pretty close to Orwin Manor. I don't think it'd be down in South Orlando, would it? And then of course over here on the left, a Sunoco gas station. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's really figure out where this is. So let's turn to the Sanborn fire insurance maps. So 1924, perfect timing, right, for the map. So it's a little sketchy about getting the right map from the right time for this section of Orwin Manor. So I struggled for a bit. and I found this. So if you look at this, you will see this says auto repair. Gee, auto repair, auto repair. This looks like that would be a gas station there and there. So that looks pretty darn good. And then if you really look at it, you see a structure back here, set back a bit, looks like that structure. So I think we nailed it. So I think the Commerce Bank and Trust is right here where the Sunoco station was. And Orwin Manor basically starts right here, right on this point. And at first I thought a clue was the street lights, because these were the traditional Orwin Manor street lights, which we still have today in the Winter Park section. But then I noticed that they went all the way down the street. So I think it was probably pretty typical everybody's buying from the same vendor at the time. So Walter Rose, Walter W. Rose. I had no clue what his middle name was, but I found out his middle name was Washington. Named after Washington Irving. Now I have no clue. It was probably the first president, I'm thinking. So age 16, born in Athens, Georgia. He's actually managing a Western Union office in Georgia at the age of 16. So I'm thinking, how old do you think he is in that picture?
16.
16 maybe? Who knows? I don't know where the picture, when it was taken or where, but I did get that off the Orange County Regional History Center site. I guess I would have to pay to get the words removed, but I thought you'd enjoy seeing the words. So he's then sent to Jacksonville, on to Orlando. He gets married in 1912, and he meets Charlie Estelle Smith, known as Stella. So everybody called her Stella. So I guess nobody really called her Charlie. And why she was named Charlie, that I don't know. So they had a daughter named Harriet. She got a nickname Babe. So she was Harriet Babe Rose. She was born in 1915. So next we're going to see where they lived first. They lived in Winter Park. So Stella Rose always considered Winter Park her true home, even though she spent most of the rest of her life in Orlando. So they lived in Pansy Cottage. And I think some people probably here have heard of Pansy Cottage. So Pansy Cottage was really this pretty incredible, large structure. And it was right next door to the All Saints Episcopal Church on Interlochen Avenue. And you can see Interlochen Avenue in the picture on the left and in the picture on the right. And I'm not sure what portion that is. I'm not sure if the structure on the left of the 1890s picture is also Pansy Cottage or not. It could be. Rachel is nodding her head yes. Good, thank you, Rachel. Confirmation. That's why you do these presentations, you'll learn a lot. So Pansy Cottage was actually built by Reverend Gustavus Eldon and his wife Isabel Eldon, who wrote religious works for young people. They were rock stars of the era. They sold thousands of books, and maybe even more than thousands, but the population wasn't a lot then, so that would have been a lot. So after 1929, it was converted to a rooming house called the Interlochen Inn. It was demolished in '55, and a portion of the Langford Hotel was built there.
Oh, the Langford. Wow.
So you'll see the picture where the residences, the condominiums are, and just to the left of that would be the Alfond Inn. And All Saints would be to the right, the current All Saints. So Walter Rose is on the move. He enters the real estate business. Okay, he was done with whatever he was doing at the time. I guess he left Western Union. He was buying land for citrus at the time. And citrus was a viable way to make money at the time. The freezes from the late 1800s were passed. The trees that had been replanted, and people were making money doing that. So he planted Eola Rose in 1918. He planted Rose Arden in 1919, 5 sections of Rosemere. Then he moved into this house in 1923, and it's on East Vanderbilt. And if you don't know where that is, it's essentially across from White Wolf Cafe down on Orange Avenue. So that's all Rosemere. It was all Rosemere to the right there, to the west, all in that area there. He did 5 subdivisions in there. And he bought his house on 7 acres, and he and Stella lived there for a long time until they finally moved to Rose Isle. So in 1924, he formed the Central Florida Development Company and purchased land in Orwin Manor for $1,300 an acre. Okay, so how that relates today, it's actually pretty cheap compared to, inflation today, but it isn't inflation that makes the difference, it's the land value that went up really tremendously. And then he went on to do Beverly Shores and Rose Isle, which we're all going to touch upon and see how they all kind of fit together. This is like a puzzle we're putting together when we get to Orwin Manor. So he plats Rose Arden, which is a really cool little subdivision if you haven't had a chance to go through there. It's at its heart is the Dixon Azalea Park along Fern Creek. So you've heard of the street Fern Creek, you've driven on it, but it's actually named after a creek, which runs right through the heart, and you can see it running down the center. So someone won $25 in gold for coming up with a name. So once again, publicity tying in there, it was probably a big deal. $25 in 1919 was nothing to sneeze at. So there was a wood bridge there. Let me go back and show you where the wood bridge is located. There's a wood bridge across Fern Creek right down here. So 1919, there's the wood bridge. And it was replaced in 1926 with the bridge you see to the lower right. And if you go down some of the stairs, you're going to walk along the creek through this beautiful park down there. And it's really, really neat. So he did donate all that land to the city, and I think we kind of know why he did that, because he was paying taxes on it and he had to maintain it. And if the city could take it over, well, then he was done. Once he sold all the property, he was out of there. So what I'm trying to do is include some of the houses which look close to being original there, or definitely not, ones that were torn down and rebuilt. So you kind of get a little bit of a flavor for the architecture that was going on in the subdivisions as we go on through the years. So part of Rose Arden also has become the Lake Lasona Historic District, because so many of the houses were still in good shape and historic. So it's a really interesting neighborhood to walk through. So then the first section of Rosemere, and interesting to see this plat if you go back to 1921, because this was called Orlando Winter Park Highway. Okay, and now it's known as Orange Avenue. So it's really confusing as you're reading a lot of these things, because a lot of names changed. And I don't know how this works, but obviously somebody was able to go in and take a road name or a lake name and just change names on it. And I don't know if you say a prayer and it happens, or you have to go to some higher authority, but there's a lot of that going on. So you can look at some of these subdivision maps and go, I have no clue where this is, looking at Google Maps, but then you can finally figure it out. So sadly, our I-4 actually ended up going right through here. So right through the heart of the first section of Rosemere. But it could have gone through Orwin Manor, so I'm okay. So some of the homes of Rosemere looking quite similar to Rose Arden. We're only a few years apart here. But you're seeing two-story houses, you're seeing Mediterranean Revival, you're seeing bungalows. So it's a really great mix of architecture, the kind of neighborhood you'd like to be in, where you probably meet your neighbors. Okay, but Walter W. Rose had higher hopes for Orlando, and undoubtedly his pocketbook. So this illustration was done by the Henri Mertz Studios, or maybe if you're from Florida, it was the Henry Mertz Studios, 30 Church Street. Actually right off of Orange Avenue, I think it used to be the Barnett Bank Plaza. That's where 30 Church Street is. So I actually Googled that studio and I could find nothing. So I'm going to get with Rachel, because I know she can do a deep search for me. Because I'm really curious as to what these guys did, because this is a beautiful illustration. So let's do a little quiz here. So can you name the lake? So let's start with this big one here. Lake.
Sue.
Okay. Lake.
Rowena.
Okay. Lake. Estelle. Not named after Estelle Rose, by the way. It was named before her. And Lake. This is a toughie. Wynya. Okay. So these are all related here to all of Walter Rose's development. So he ended up with a lot of lakefront property. Smart purchase of land, if you ask me. Although he had, Fern Creek through Rose Arden, he didn't have lakes in his other subdivisions. So 1924, he plats the Westminster section. It was a section that I actually live in. Bounded by Harmon Avenue to the north. And remember Harmon Avenue, that's a big deal. Clay Street's a big deal. Orange Avenue is here. Okay. That was not a big deal years earlier. And here are the railroad tracks. It was the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. So once again, a contest to name this new subdivision. And Louise Morton was successful. I don't know what she won. And the name Orwin, as many of you may know, was a combination of Orlando and Winter Park. So 1924, okay, starts this new Orwin Manor subdivision. Florida is on fire. And it's not because of a drought either. Okay, Detroit News sets a record with an annual run of 3.5 million lines of advertising. And a year later, the Miami Herald runs over 34.1 million lines.
Wow.
We're talking nationwide of all the newspapers in the United States. Okay, legislature, okay? First they dealt with getting railroads here, okay? What was their next move? Eliminating the state's income tax and the inheritance tax. Okay, is there a chance that somebody here might have moved here because of that? Okay, I'm sure they were back then. That was a big deal. Okay, 8-foot wide boardwalk encircling the equator. That's how much lumber came to Florida. And D.P. Davis, okay, so you remember how much Walter Rose bought his land for? $1,300 an acre. So D.P. Davis is now selling lots at $5,610. That was average cost. So I don't know what size the lots were, but I'm sure they were under an acre. Okay? You know, unfortunately, 300 lots were still underwater. They had a little work to do. But that's what the frenzy was about back then. I mean, people were buying land like crazy, and most of them lived up north and probably had never even been to Florida. So here's the climate we're in. Okay, so Walter Rose, it's all going on down in the south, we're going crazy right now, and Walter Rose is doing his thing in Orlando. And of course, others are doing their thing in College Park, as you heard from other Parlor talks. So, next section, Stratford. So if you put those two together, you're going to see the railroad is a dividing line between them. So you have both sides of the track coming together there. And Lake Wynya to the south. Told you the lake was important. Okay, some of the homes in the Stratford section. Got a little bit bigger than what we were seeing in the previous subdivisions. Okay, 1925, things are still going crazy. 2.5 million people estimated migrate to Florida. Maybe the largest human migration in U.S. history. You know, we probably wonder if we were going to sink. There's a lot of people, a lot of structures. Okay, people outside of Florida are spending more than $1 million per day to buy Florida property, and it put a huge strain on northern banks. Okay, Florida bank deposits go from 180 to 875 million. And you might have heard of Ponzi. Okay, so he's released from federal prison and he comes to Florida. Why would he do that? Okay. So he's selling 10 million small building lots near Jacksonville. And as you might be reading there, they were actually on swampland 65 miles inland. So I guess he was headed back to prison. And comedian Milton Berle, I don't know how old he was at the time, but he was pretty clever back then. I just got wonderful news from my real estate agent in Florida. They found land on my property. So Walter Rose had his work cut out for him. So he wasn't doing what they're doing down there, like Davis was doing, with the islands, or they're doing in Miami Beach, which was almost nothing, having to pump stuff out. But he still had to shape the land. So he was filling in a 3-acre lake. Anybody ever hear about a 3-acre lake in Orwin Manor being filled in? Okay, well, I found it. Okay, he was digging 3 canals. He was building roads. He was landscaping. Okay, and you can see from the pictures, there was a dredger working. He had a superintendent of construction. He had the grading crew, the paving crew. Things were going crazy. Okay, so let's see if we can find the lake. Okay, so 3-acre lake. So Lake Wynya is right here, and that's 17 acres. So you can use that for reference. So the lake is right there. Okay, so that lake is actually just west of current-day North Mills Avenue and between Nottingham and Chichester. So if you live in that area, there may have been a sinkhole underneath your house.
I was just going to say.
Given the shape of it, it is almost certainly a sinkhole.
Yeah, so it probably is from that shape. So anyway, so he had enough lakefront property and he wanted the lots. So that was one of the first mysteries solved. So shaping the land. So we've got all these lakes drain through Mead Garden, and drain to the St. Johns River. So one of the rivers, one of the few rivers in the world that actually, head north. The St. Johns is one of the great ones that do that. So we had the canal here between Lake Winnie and Estelle, between Estelle and Rowena and Lake Sioux, and then from there it heads up to Mead Garden. So that's present-day Mead Garden, that swampy area there, and that's where the boardwalk goes through. But current-day pictures of the canals that he put in. So the Florida Sanitarium is actually on Lake Estelle, right where Advent Health is now. A little to the side, you can see from the modern-day, the current-day picture, and you can see where the canal to Lake Winyah was. So I found this really interesting, where it said that the workers had not missed a Saturday in years. And up above it says the purse strings are untied every Saturday. So if you want your paycheck, would you go to work that day? I think so. So that was really clever. So they got you to work on Saturdays because that was your payday. And I love this picture of maybe one of the workers or a passerby, and this is heading south on Orange Avenue, and this is Wilkinson and one of the arches at the time. So I really loved having gotten this picture. This was from Mary Soul, one of our neighbors in Orwin Manor, and this was given to her by Jack Kazantzis as a Christmas card. So this is Jack Kazantzis when he was 3 years old, with his grandmother standing in front of their house on Pelham. And I took a picture from the same spot today, and you can see the pine flatwoods are gone, and obviously there's a lot of houses there now. And you're looking across Pelham and Clay Street, way in the distance. And I'm wondering if that's maybe the same live oak tree. You would think in about 100 years it might be bigger. Not 100 years, 90 years, but in that small space it could very well be the same live oak tree. So how did Walter Rose make this happen? Well, he needed a place for a headquarters. So originally he was renting an office in Orlando. And then he had the funds to build this 2-story building on Orange Avenue. It's still there today, and I have some pictures of his offices inside, designed by Murray S. King, and it was actually built to support 10 stories. But because of the Depression, he probably never, ended up adding the extra stories on. And it's across from the Beecham Theater, literally directly across. And you might notice that what's called a little cartouche at the top, a little medallion, has his name in it, Rose. So it was a source of humor then and today. So the Orlando Sentinel from just a few months ago, I read the comics every day if I can. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. He said, I'm doing a talk, this is perfect. And it was Kenneth Roberts who wrote a number of books about Florida. His one in Florida in 1926, he said, how about he was basically talking about the Dixie Highway, and about there was an articulated serpent, 1,500 miles in length. And he goes, it managed to wriggle forward at a rate of about 30 miles an hour. So I didn't do the math, but 1,500 miles and 30 miles an hour, you did a lot of camping out, I think. Say trucks and limousines and couples and coupes and little tin cars purred and wheezed and roared and clanked and boomed along the road. It's quite a procession. Okay, so Rose is now moving east. So we did Westminster, we did Stratford. So you see Stratford section right here, and you'll see this little jog right here, and Lake Estelle down here. And now you're seeing, to the right, you're seeing the Lakeshore section. But the Florida land boom was already starting to just slow down a little bit. So while he platted that, however, the warning signs were appearing. So 75% of automobile purchasers are doing so on credit. Wow, that's a lot of money floating out there. Okay, the Biltmore Hotel opens, probably not good timing. The Nation magazine writes, the Florida boom has collapsed, and players are now cashing in and paying up. Category 4 hurricane hit South Florida, $500 million in damage, so they're really hurting in South Florida. So all those developers down there were really, really upset. And 117 Florida and Georgia banks fail. Meanwhile, locally, the R.C. Stevens Construction Company is founded, and they're still going strong today. So I came across an oral history from 1987. Stella Rose, I didn't do the math, I'm not sure how old she was at the time. She was probably in her 90s, and her daughter were interviewed by the Winter Park Library and the Winter Park Historical Society. And Babe Spears said, during the Depression, that if you could pay the taxes on the land you own, then you could weather the Depression. If you couldn't, then you lost everything. And Walter's wife said, my husband walked this floor and rattled the change in his pockets till I thought I would go mad. Every night he would come home just worried sick. So if you think about it, he hadn't sold all of his property yet. He owned a lot of land and never sold the lots yet. So he was paying taxes on all of that, except for probably Dixon Park, which he had given to the city. So he got that off his back. So 10 years later, interestingly enough, the exact same plat, but now it's called Beverly Shores. So I don't know if there was a stigma with Lake Shore at the point because it had kind of gone through the doldrums of the Depression, but now it was called Beverly Shores. Some of the houses in Beverly Shores, so see the architecture, see the size of the houses, as they're starting to get a little larger, the lot sizes are increasing. Another mystery, the Shropshire Jog. So many of you have driven up 1792 up Mills and taken this curve right here and never wondered why this little sliver of land exists right there. Well, it's because this is what it was originally. There was no 1792 or Mills Avenue. Shropshire Road went to here and ended. So it ends right there just north of Lake Estelle. And here's where I think that little missing lake was, by the way, the Lost Lake. So the reason this came about was there was talk about getting a decent highway into Winter Park, and Walter Rose actually owned Lake Estelle, and he donated the land. I don't know if he's paying taxes on the lake or not, probably not. But he donated the land, and the causeway was built. So we have this picture of it under construction, and I have it labeled so you can get an idea of how it was all going together, and when the jog still existed before they actually put the roadway through. Named after Charles Andrews, a U.S. Senator, for 13 years. Harry S. Truman was on hand for the dedication in 1949, along with Hamilton Holt and Florida Governor Fuller Warren. I'm sure Walter Rose was there, but we have not found a picture of him yet. And if you want to see this plaque in person, there's one on each side of the causeway at either end. So Walter was priming the pump for Orwin Manor sales. So we're going back just a little bit from the causeway. And, maybe you'd seen the Bellevue Heights Gateway. Again, remember the one near the supervisor elections office? And he said, I think I could do better than that. And he sure did. So here's a historic picture of 1, 2, 3 of the gates. There were actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 total. And there's only 3 existing today. So 1990, Stella Rose was still alive. Babe Spears was in attendance when the 3 remaining gates were dedicated as Orlando Historic Landmarks. So Walter Rose was a promoter, and he was promoting Orwin Manor as the Great White Way. And when I first saw that, I said, whoa, the 20s, Great White Way, what does that mean? And then I realized that Broadway was dubbed the Great White Way because of the lights. And prior to it being lit down there, women would not go out at night. They would never go to Broadway. But once they had the lights, they felt safe, and Broadway really started to thrive. So putting in lighting was a big deal. And I don't know if this was the first subdivision in Orlando that got lights, but they sure played it up. And of course it had the gleaming concrete sidewalks, it had curbs. There was a welcome sign over Orange Avenue. Berkshire Avenue is just to the left, the railroad tracks are to the right, and in the little bit of the distance behind the sign, there's a sign for Walter Rose promoting his Orwin Manor subdivision. He built a sales office in Orwin Manor. It's right where the park at Orwin Manor is right now. And nicely designed, a little bit of a Mediterranean revival, rustic looking, a little bit like Casa Felice, you might say. And he actually had a bus. And if you showed up, he would drive you around, somebody, probably not him, would drive you around all the streets through Orwin Manor to select a home site. And it's interesting because subdivisions today Almost every subdivision is done by a developer who buys all the lots, like Walter Rose did, but they build all the lots. And they all look kind of the same, kind of cookie cutter. Maybe you have choices of 4 or 5 types of houses that might flip the floor plans a little bit or something. Not with Walter Rose and not back then. You notice the diversity in houses? Because you bought the land and then you either got an architect on board or, you'll see a little bit later where the plans might have come from, and you hired a builder to build it. And they got all the subcontractors and built it out. So that's what really makes all the charm in the neighborhoods from back then. So love this aerial. So easy to get oriented here because here are the gates. And way up here you see 2 little gleaming objects. Those are the gates of the northern end. Up at 1792 today, Orlando Avenue. Here's the sales office, and there's the welcome sign right there. So the sales office was removed at some unknown date. When we moved there in '85, it was gone. Does anybody here by any chance remember that sales office or the gates? Rats. Okay, I was hoping. So sales office was long gone, and the Orwin Manor Westminster Association, which I've been a member of for a long time, we actually got a park installed on that property. We actually went to meet with Mrs. Rose and Harriet Spears and asked them if they would donate the land. 4 houses could have been bought there. We kind of thought they'd kind of forgotten about the property, got mowed like once a year. It was just this vacant lot. The kids played baseball out there. And they said, well, come back and we'll talk to you later. So we went back, talked to them, and they said, no, we've donated land before. Nobody ever appreciated it, and we're not interested in selling the land. And 3 months later, a for sale sign went up on the property. And we went, oh, there it goes. And we went to the city of Winter Park, and they agreed to buy it. And then we got a park. So here's the park being dedicated.
Stephen, what year was that?
That was 1992 when we dedicated it. And the neighbors pitched in, helped with the landscaping, helped put in the sidewalks, the irrigation, put in all the bricks in the patio. So we have some early photos of some of the first homes from the Westminster section of Orwin Manor, and you'll see them here. Actually, the house that Chris and I live in is right here. And we think that house is that picture is probably from the 40s, 50s probably. This house here, the Stutz residence. You may have heard of the Stutz Bearcat, the automobile. Okay, this is an original Stutz Bearcat. It's much smaller in size. But Austin, tell me about this car.
It was my grandpa's when he was a kid. And so he's got Stutz Bearcat, he's got the Stanley Steamer, he's got 3 or 4 of them, but I just thought it was cool that Stutz lived in this neighborhood.
Austin brought this with him, okay? Which is why you do these presentations. You never know what you're going to find. Thank you very much. So that house is still, all these houses actually still exist today, and they're all in the historic register. Okay, so where do the designs for these houses come from? So Kristen's mother gave us a bunch of Country Life magazines, these big oversized magazines from the 20s into the 30s. And I was in bed one night and I was flipping through them page by page by page. It had landscape design and this and that and everything in it. And I got to the very last page of the last book. And I woke Kristen up, but you're not going to believe this, our house is in here. And she said, what? And so there was an ad from one of these catalogs. It had a picture would look like our house in there. So I said, we've got to find this book. So we searched around and found out that the New York Public Library had a copy. So the next time we were in New York, we'd made arrangements, and they brought out these books for us, and that was the room where we did our research in. And we brought those books out, and we did our research. And it was the Homecraft Homes book, and there's the picture that I saw. And there's the floor plan, and when flipped, it matched our house, and you can see that it was kind of a little different from ours. It was flipped. The whole house was flipped, and they did that typically like that. And that's another picture of our house. I don't know who's in the photograph, however. The Mirabeaus had lived in our house for a long time, and for I think almost 50 years when we bought it in '99. So the house had been off the market for a long time. So anyway, so we were thrilled to actually come across this. And so flipping through the books, son of a gun, found this one And that's the house almost across the street from us.
Wow.
Okay.
$6,000.
$6,000 in 1919 to build the house, and you could buy the plans, the specs, and the material list for $35. That's a good deal, I would think.
Wow.
So during the Great Depression, sales tanked, but after World War II, the sales picked up, but the houses were different. So the houses in the 40s and 50s, you're not seeing any of the Mediterranean revival styles anymore. The bungalows were not showing up really, and actually the building materials were different. You're seeing a concrete block, particularly what we call the oversized brick. So it looks like a large brick, but it's actually a concrete block, but it's more like this, rectangular, a small rectangle like that than the typical block. So in the late 60s, we had a little chunk of Orwin Manor homes removed surgically with a rezoning. And when Florida Gas came in, and I was just talking to a gentleman back there who actually knows more about it, and we're going to get together later. So this is the property here that was, all the homes were either moved or demolished. And this is the parking lot now, but there's parking here, and the Florida Gas building is here. So historic preservation. I don't know if that would have happened if we had an ordinance back then. But it was because of Casa Feliz being moved and almost lost that Winter Park got an historic preservation ordinance. So this is kind of a serious part of the talk now. So Phil Eschbach is here. His photograph's on the top with Casa Feliz on the move. Thank you, Phil, for that picture. Some people might be curious how they actually moved this house. It wasn't brick by brick. They moved the whole chunk, including the arch. And then what was called the carriage house on that end was actually, it had been damaged before the demolition was stopped, and that was actually rebuilt by a master mason. So typically, structures need to be 50 years old to be considered historic. That's pretty much true nationwide. And in Winter Park, it should, and like most places, it needs to be a contributing historic resource. So it's so hard to get on the register as an historic house, you have to fill out the top half of that form. That's all you do. Bingo. Then it goes to the city and they do the rest. So I brought some of the forms, they're on the table over there. So if you think your house is eligible, if you're in Winter Park, go for it. 50 years old, and they will probably find a way to say it's worth keeping. So there are benefits, however. Not only do you get this really cool plaque, and you can see Chris and I getting our plaque there in the library actually of Casa Feliz, along with some of our neighbors. And you get to use historic setbacks, which is huge, because setbacks have changed now. And Alan Hatchett's a builder here in Winter Park, and he can tell you how important setbacks are. If you can go back to historic 7-foot setbacks instead of doing a 20-foot setback, wow. Okay, you can get exterior improvement grants, and of course you get the plaques, which for us was the big enchilada. And of course you save the house, so you're saving the character. So we have 25 homes on the historic register in Orwin Manor at this point. So if you go left to right, you'll see them in order in which they were put on the register. And at some point you'll see, there's our house, 1425 Berkshire, right there. So you'll see it today. It's changed a little bit from black and white. And the house was white until after Hurricane Charlie dropped a tree on our house and we had it repainted. And then we do what we call creme caramel color. So diversity of architectural styles. A lot of people who are in this room tonight have their homes on this. And we've got room for more. Actually, there was one that actually went before the board today to see if it went on the register. I'm not sure what the results of that was. So the association's been busy. We were founded in 1983. We have a tight-knit neighborhood, great association. We got a grant from the city a number of years ago when we put in our historic markers. You might have seen those bronze plaques around the borders. Our centennial's coming up, if you're doing the math. 1924, 2024, so next year in the fall is 100 years from when we were platted. So our goal is to get our gates rebuilt up at the north end. We also have a 100 trees for 100 years project going on to get more street trees and more trees planted in people's yards. And I think at this point we probably have about 50 trees planted. More historic register homes. So one of our more recent ones, and the owners are here in the room right there, John and Meg. This house, 1475 Berkshire, was very close to being demolished. and working with the city's Historic Preservation Board and the City Commission and the P&Z Board, we managed to make it work and save the house. And interestingly enough, before the house was sold to the developer that was going to tear the house down, the owner of the house gave me a set of plans for the house that came out of the Bungalow Craft Company book. So we've had them scanned, and Rachel now has them archived at the library. So they've been saved. So we all partner together on this. Historical markers. We're working with the city to get an historical marker for Orwin Manor. It's probably going to go in the little park across from Commerce Bank and Trust, and partnering with Castle Fleas on a state marker to go at the park in Orwin Manor where the sales office was. We're planning block parties and a celebration party in the fall. So we're going to do 6 block parties. 10 years ago, we did a cake. We're going to do a lot more for 100 years. So we got more to do, though. We have a lot more to learn about Walter Rose, Orwin Manor, and our houses. And I ask all of you, have you lived in any of his developments and have a story to tell? Have you ever met Walter or Stella Rose, or maybe their daughter Babe? Have a story to share? Do you have any historic photographs to share? Whether of Orwin Manor or maybe something else historic before they're lost. There are places to have them scanned and save them. So what happened to some of our icons? So we have Meisner, Fisher, Davis, Merrick, and Rose. So you've learned a lot about them. So Meisner died in debt at age 50. Carl Fisher died in debt at age 65. Did not die in a car crash. You would have thought he would have, for his love of automobiles and racing. D.P. Davis, age 40, lost at sea, died in debt, and supposedly a suicide. It was the liner crossing the Atlantic, and he disappeared. And a number of people said that he was despondent and probably took the plunge. George Merrick, who did Coral Gables, died at age 55 in debt. And Walter Rose, however, was a different story. So I've got a long list there, a lot of stuff, and I left a lot of it out. But he was a member of the Florida State Senate for a long time. He was on taxation committees. He donated 23 acres to Mead Garden. The Florida tax program, he was incorporated major measures of that. He drafted Florida's first real estate license law. Before that, it was kind of open season. And if there's any realtors here and if they know what it used to be, well, they weren't alive then, I'm sure, but if they do the history and see how it was wild, wild west probably. And the Orlando Sentinel-Star proposed Rose as a candidate for governor. He declined, but they went on to say he has not failed to pass any of his bills, so all of his bills that he made put up there passed, which meant he was able to go across the aisle. And he was a legislator of unimpeachable integrity. This photograph of him there is interesting. I couldn't fit the whole photograph on there, but there's actually a picture of him there. And then there's a photograph to the right that has Joseph Stalin in it, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, because it's about World War II. So if I do this presentation again, I'll have to find a way to put that in there. It's a fascinating photograph. So he wasn't quite done, so he platted 11 sections of Rose Isle, so little bits and pieces of it. That was the first section. Lake Rowena down here, and Orlando Museum of Art is over here on the other side of Mills. Some of the homes, you'll see some of the beloved styles as you're going to see if you ever drive through that neighborhood, you'll recognize some of those houses. The third section, he built a house. And unfortunately, he only lived a year in that house, but he had probably the best lot of all of Orwin Manor, with all of that lakefront on Lake Sioux. And there's a picture of his house. So Senator Rose, as he was known, is buried in Winter Park's Palm Cemetery with his wife, Stella, their daughter, Babe, and her husband, Glenn Spears, who was actually a haberdasher. You know, everybody remembers what a haberdasher was. It's sold hats, yes, in Orlando. And just off to the left of here is Stella's family is buried there. So you remember Pansy Cottage and her father? So his father and mother and some of her siblings are buried there. Were his dreams fulfilled? So he constructed more than subdivisions. He crafted well-lit neighborhoods I call them neighborhoods, not subdivisions, with sidewalks, curbs, and diverse architecture. And you've seen the architecture. They attract homeowners who continue to cherish the location, charm, and history. Well done, Senator. Thank you for attending. If you have something to share, take a picture of my email.